All right, well, I'm gonna see if this video is gonna work out because I probably need to remember to speak only when facing this way. But this is gonna basically be about how your brain works. And when I say brain, I mean your brain-mind connection. You're not gonna find this in any textbooks because it's something that I've come up with myself. You're gonna find pieces of it in some books, but you won't find this complete theory. There's also a much more detailed write-up that I did years ago on my blog, so I'll put a link to that below. And just want to remind you, I will always put the link to the GoFundMe for Dane Cook to get me to the USA so that I can meet some of you. And even if you can't come yourself, please help him out, sponsor it. You know, even if you just throw $5 at it, which a lot of you have, by the way, recently. So thank you for that. Without further ado then, this is kind of a representation of how your brain works. And I'm going to have to draw a sketch and then I will let you know what each part is. So I'm not going to bother with the classical definitions and that originally. I'll just get right into it. Now, this diagram that I've done here represents your mind. And these barriers, this first barrier here, so that so the top part, which oh, I might have just gone a little bit off camera there, hopefully not. Let's have a quick check. There, hopefully you can see that. Anyway, this top part here is your conscious mind. That, in my opinion, is between, let me just put it here. In my opinion, that's between 2 and 5% of your mind's capacity at best. I think if it's 5%, you're kind of genius level guy. And this is the critical faculty. Now that barrier is basically what exists between our subconscious, unconscious, and our conscious mind. And it's what you essentially have when you're awake. You know how, like when you're in a dream, you can just pull back on the wheel of your car and then you're flying and then there's a tiger in the Himalayas that becomes a dwarf. That's what happens when you don't have a critical faculty. You know, when your critical faculty is working, you get dressed before you go to work and so on. When your critical faculty goes out the window, which can also happen as a result of dementia, Alzheimer's and so on, you might get to work before you put your clothes on. And that's sort of also what happens in dreams. Now, below this, you've got, now classically speaking, by the way, in classical terms, the conscious mind is considered to be about 10%, and I'll come back to what these percentages means. But so when I write these percentages there, that's sort of the classical definition. Most books don't even have this, and I'll come to it. So that's your conscious mind. They approximately say 10%. This is usually considered anywhere between sort of, 20 to 80%. On average, I'd say about 50, 60%. And then there's another part here, which I reckon is between, 20, 30%. Now, what do I mean by these percentages? Are we saying that when you're conscious, you only use 2 to 5% of your brain? To a certain extent, yes, because it depends on what you're measuring and how you're measuring it. But to give you an idea, your conscious mind, and I'm going to try and write this in a different color, and I hope you can see that on the video. It's not that clear, but your conscious mind can handle between 9 and 13 bits of data per second or thereabouts. So I'll write it over here. So that's 9. I'll try and make it a bit bigger. This is so the conscious mind can handle between 9 and 13 bits of data. And I've sort of discussed this in some of my earlier videos as well. The subconscious mind, and when I say subconscious, we generally also include the unconscious in this particular metric, but nobody really knows. Depends on how you measure it and where you've measured it. But the range is between 2.3 million and 400 billion. That's not a mistake, 400 billion bits of data. Now, this means that when you are able to process or do things on a subconscious or unconscious level, even if you're only using a tiny percentage of your mind, you will outperform conscious performers by, magnitudes, orders of magnitude. And to a certain extent, that's what idiot savants have. Guys who can work out the square root of a huge number, in their head, and they just know it. That is when some wiring is somewhat scrambled up in such a way that that particular function has access to a larger part of your mind. Now, the thing is, for example, Systema trains you neurologically to try and use your subconscious part of your mind in combat, which is, it's not what it's designed to do, but the Russians, being Russians, will try and backwards engineer whatever works best, and it works. Which is why a guy that does Systema, even if he has only trained for a few months, can sometimes, take out, I'm thinking of specific examples which I can't and won't mention in detail, but people that I know intimately well, for example, when half drunk, come out of some gambling place, get attacked by 2 armed guys with knives without even realizing it, knock them both out in a single movement, one with the flat of the hand and the other one with the knee. And you try and train that all your life, and it's, it probably won't work. But when your unconscious mind is operating at peak performance, just think about it. The difference between, let's call it 10 to make the numbers easy, and let's say it's only 1 million bits of data. You're talking a difference between 1 0 behind the number 1 and, 6 zeros behind the number 1. That's 5 orders of magnitude. It's a lot. It's a difference between 1 and 100,000. So if unconsciously, subconsciously, you only manage to process, a tenth, 100th. Let's say you process 100, not even that. Let's say that you start fighting with your 10%, right? Just 10, never mind 10%. Let's say that you're using 1,000th, right? Let's say the numbers are 10 bits of data and 1 million bits of data. If you can fight with only 1,000th of the ability that you have in your subconscious, you're fighting you're fighting 10 times better than somebody who's using all of his conscious mind. That's a huge difference, and that's why Systema works the way that it does. Of course, you need to be trained properly. You need to have a proper teacher that understands how to train that, and you need to go through the drills thousands of times, because that's just how you do it. Now, what does this mean personality-wise and so on? And what do I mean by this other barrier? We'll get to that in a second. But basically, conventional psychology believes that all your troubles in life sit in the subconscious, And when you resolve them, your conscious mind is more free. Now, there is some truth to this, because certain trauma, events in your life, significant emotional events, in other words, events that has a significant emotional impact, do get stored and trapped in the subconscious. And if you like, they create little bubbles, sort of. Now, depending on the nature of these bubbles can actually become entire personalities. It is a well-known fact that in order to create, Manchurian candidate type people, trauma is used to split the personality so that these people form alternate personas. And sex abuse victims and people that have been ritually sexually abused as children will develop a persona to survive that. There are ways, and there have been, this has been done by the MK Ultra guys, the CIA, these people. And if you've read the transcripts of some of the experiments that these guys did, these are supposed doctors that did this stuff, and it's absolutely vicious. I mean, they destroyed human beings just to figure out, how pliable the brain is and so on. And it's horrific shit. It's right up there with, Mengele type stuff. Abusing children on purpose and so on. And these were documented as medical research, sort of a little bit hush-hush, but you can find the details of it. It's disgusting. And the thing is, you can and do create the sort of split personality to survive the trauma. And then you can direct that personality to be a particular thing, or to be triggered by particular events, or all the way down to like a particular phrase. These are not sustainable long-term. Ultimately, there will be a breakdown, especially when the person is removed from that sort of control, and even when they're not, because they're just insane. And I mean that in the etymological sense of the word. They're not sane. They're not sane ways of being, and therefore they break down. What you will not find in most psychology books is this barrier, what I call the language factor, or the unconscious. The unconscious part of the brain happens below what I call the language faculty. So you've got a critical faculty and you've got a language faculty. So all the stuff that happens to you before you have language, so when you're a baby, and there can be pretty traumatic stuff going on here, which you won't be able to access, because with your conscious mind, when you access your subconscious mind, either through dreams, hypnosis, or quite deep hypnosis, or sometimes certain use of drugs, the use of drugs is not recommended because it is uncontrolled. You don't know what's going to happen. If you could get actual proper LSD with a person that knows what they're doing and they're benevolent, and these are big ifs, because most hypnotists are screwed up characters, just like most psychologists are, nuts. So, you have to be quite careful who you go to. But if you get a decent hypnotist or a decent doctor, and you could have a controlled LSD experience, that has been to be positive. And they did that on about 30,000 convicts. The recidivity rate, in other words, the rate of reoffending in convicts is about 85%. The ones that had a single trip of LSD guided by people that were making sure that you have a good trip was less than 25%. So there was a huge change in the personality of the person. But aside from those type of things, most people never get to the unconscious. Now, to get to the unconscious, you can get there with hypnosis, but you need probably repeated sessions. And you can do it with self-hypnosis, but the first thing that you will experience when you get down to this level is terror. You will experience fear. And essentially because at this level, you are emotionally back at the same level that you were when these experiences happened. So you do not have the ability, you have it, objectively you now have the ability because you're an adult and you have language and so on. But when you get down here, the sensation will be precisely the one of complete lack of control, of not being able to handle anything, and whatever emotions are stored in there, whatever emotions come up in there will scare the living shit out of you. Now, when I learned hypnosis, I did it on myself, first of all, to levels and depths that I haven't taken anybody in a hypnotic state Probably not even to the level that I've taken myself. And I certainly have never taken anybody below that level, because I want to be 100% sure that I know what I'm doing, so that I don't, cause any damage. Because one wrong word said without even bad intention can cause some pretty deep changes in a person if you're not careful. So that's why I spent 6 months reading everything that Milton Erickson wrote for 8 hours a day, and then I practiced on everyone and their dog that were, willing participants in hypnotic stuff, and that's what I'm pretty good at. But when you get to the unconscious, that's where the traumatic stuff that is below the level of language, or just when you're just about to learn language. So sort of 2 years old and less, maybe 3 years old and less, depending on the person. And this stuff you generally don't have any memory of, or if you have a memory of, it's confused with emotions and feelings, and you don't have language to even explain it to yourself. Now, there is something that I did not mention in the article that I wrote originally, although in the full explanation that I came up with at the time, I do have this third level of barrier. Let's call it I called it the death barrier, because when you die, you don't end. And this here is what I would suggest is God, or a connection to the divine, and so on. There are times when you can access stuff here, which is sort of a universal information, when you're still alive. But for the most part, I believe that you have to die before you get access to this area of the universal mind, if you want to call it that. I don't like calling it universal mind, because it's a very woo-woo sort of new age bullshit term. But I do believe that you do get access to a part, at least, of divinity, or of divine creation, or of heaven, call it what you want, that that's where miracles and stuff like that comes from. I believe it's this area. And I think for the most part, we only get to access that after we die. That said, some people can get some information from here, even if it's just a tiny trickle of information now and then when you're in a specific, state of prayer or whatever. And it sort of makes sense that there would be some kind of little thread that you could access. And even if it's a tiny, tiny thread, keep in mind that most of your mind you don't get to use, and that this mind here, or this level of information, is far bigger than your whole entire unconscious mind, which is let's assume the 400 billion bits of data per second. This is orders and orders of magnitude above that. So if you can even just get the tiniest bit of information from here, that's where you get people that can, prophesize the future and so on. Or that have, there has been a study done by Homerton, I think it is, Homerton and Ferrari. They did a meta-study of precognition studies that were done over a 50-year period. And they have discovered that, yes, there is a significant factor of precognition in human beings. All of the stuff, to some extent or other, described in my book, the Systema book. But why am I telling you all this? Well, because if you understand just what I've discussed here, you're ahead of the rest of the population. You're in the top 0.01% of human beings if you just understand this part. If you then start to understand how to access your subconscious on a regular basis so that you can clear it out of some of these traumas, you're doing pretty well. What nobody tells you, though, however, is that very often the traumas that happen in your subconscious have an origin in your unconscious. So you've got these original traumas that happen before you have language that lead you very often in certain life choices or pathways, or just, not your own choice, but because, the things that cause that trauma live here, and they probably raised you, they continue to create that trauma. You then get, you start to associate with people that have that sort of behavior, and the trauma continues. Why do we do this? Because your brain is very smart and very stupid. So what happens is, let's say that you had some traumatic event happen when you're 2 years old. I don't know. your dad's an alcoholic, or both your parents, let's say, are alcoholics. There's a lot of stuff that goes with that. There's neglect that goes with that. There's, a lot of neglect that goes with that. There's maybe violence. There's all sorts of things that go with that. You grow up with these people, so the trauma gets repeated and it sits in your subconscious. Then let's say you leave home. You get a clean break. You got enough money. You're now doing all right. And yet you tend up to go in relationships with people that have an alcohol problem. Well, why would that be? Because what your brain is trying to do, it's trying to recreate the trauma with a person that will allow you to have a happy ending. And if you can recreate the trauma with a person that is, reminiscent of the originator of the trauma, but this time you have a happy ending, well, then you heal. It's a little bit of a, vicious circle, because the likelihood of you getting in a relationship with another abusive alcoholic and that ending well is not very high. If, however, you can get into your subconscious and you say you get rid of this bit, you get rid of the bit that is sitting in your subconscious about, being attracted to alcoholics, because that's what happens, by the way. You're a guy who had an alcoholic mother and an alcoholic father. You now meet this pretty girl and she really ticks all your boxes right away. Why? Because subconsciously or unconsciously, 95% plus of your brain is looking for, is she pretty? Yeah, that attracts me. Does she have the same shitty behaviors that my dad used to have? Oh, yep, that ticks the box. Does she also have the same shitty behavior that mom used to have? Oh, yeah, it ticks that box too. Oh, this is perfect. She's gonna have all the same shitty behaviors that I grew up with, except this time it's all gonna work out well. And that's what your brain is trying to do. Now, unconsciously, this is all unconscious, so you're not even aware of that. You just think, no, I'm attracted to that girl. Oh, no, I don't like the fact that she drinks. And you don't. You really don't, because that does cause you, pain and whatever. But what ticked it off is the fact that unconsciously you picked up from micro cues all sorts of crap that fits with whatever happened to you before. But let's say you go to a good hypnotist or whatever, life happens to you, and over 20 years you work yourself out of that shit and you don't associate with people that drink alcohol, and that's great. Guess what? You're still going to meet somebody who doesn't abuse alcohol maybe, but they're a serial golf player and they drop everything to go and play golf, or, some other weird thing that you sort of think, but fuck, how can I be that unlucky? And again, that's because it's sitting in the unconscious. Now, to get to the unconscious and clear that stuff out, most human beings will never do it. And there are, as far as I'm aware, only really 3 ways of doing it. One is that LSD trip. I don't suggest it for a number of reasons. 1, you're not going to get clean LSD. 2, you're not going to be able to do it in a controlled condition. 3, you're not going to be do it legally. 4, let's say you find a good doctor, you find a clean LSD, and you're going to do it in a controlled thing. How do you know he's a good doctor? You don't. So option number 2 is with a hypnotist that's good. And again, that's how do you know the hypnotist is good? Most people who learn hypnosis learn it to try and fix their own crazy brain, or because they want to try and control people, or because they think that they can master the mind. And, a lot of hypnotists are assholes. That's just a fact. Now, I know that I'm an asshole myself, but I'm not that kind of an asshole. I've got different, issues. I didn't learn hypnosis to try and brainwash people or, get a sex slave cult going, or, I could do that long before I learned hypnosis. So, but the point is, repeated repeated hypnosis over time can help that. And if that's the way you want to go, I suggest you learn hypnosis and you do it on yourself. You do self-hypnosis. It's going to be a longish process. You're going to have, mistakes made along the way. Always do it in a safe environment. Always time yourself, because you will find that when you do manage to hypnotize yourself properly, your sense of time will be totally screwed. I used to write down the time before I started the hypnotic session on myself, and then I'd write down the time as soon as I wake up. And sometimes I was out for like 4 hours, and it felt like 15 minutes. And you sort of think, what the hell? So it does, it's interesting. But anyway, with hypnosis, that sort of thing, be careful. You know, there are good hypnotists, but they're few and far between. And trust yourself. If you go to a hypnotist and you don't get a good vibe, you don't get a good feeling, just walk the fuck out. You don't owe anybody anything. You don't have to stay there for the session. If you say, no, I don't feel comfortable, very sorry, bye-bye. That's it, done. You know, and that's the first thing I ever told anybody that came to me for hypnosis. I said, listen, you know, they'll tell you what they want to be there for and whatever. But I always told them, listen, if you don't get a good vibe, you don't get a good feeling, if you don't feel safe, get up and walk away. No charge, nothing. You know, just leave. It's fine. You don't have to be here. Okay, if you're gonna come here, you need to feel comfortable. You need to feel safe with the session we're gonna do. And if you've got any questions, ask them now. If anything about me like rubs you the wrong way or whatever, or you don't think, you know, this guy is the right person for this, just walk away. Trust your instinct on that. Okay. Now, it might not always be right, your instinct, but it doesn't matter. Trust your instinct, because if you're going to make a mistake, make a mistake in the side of safety, all right? Now, the other way, so there's three ways, right? I said the LSD, hypnosis. The third way is usually takes about 20 years. And that is concentrated, conscious effort at becoming whoever you want to become and working at it every day. Now, if you do that and you're really intense and you really work hard and you really throw everything you got at it, it might take you only a decade. But for most people, it's something that happens over about 2 decades, and they will tend to have mastered a skill, whether it's martial arts or painting or drawing or, you know, it doesn't have to be an artistic endeavor, but it, you know, it could be farming, it could be, you know, cattle raising or whatever, but it generally has to be something solid that has measurable sort of results. So that's probably not the greatest news you wanted to hear, but it is possible. So there is that. And this should also help you understand not just yourself, which is the key thing, right? Know yourself. That is the pivotal thing you need to do in life. Know yourself. That's number one. But it can also help you understand others. Now, if you've got all of this, if you understand all of this, and you add the knowledge of God to it, you are definitely in the top sort of 1% of human beings ever that have ever lived, pretty much. So it is useful. It's a useful model, and it works. So I just thought I'd share it with you, and hopefully it's of some use to you, and it might help you, you know, figure some stuff out. I will put the link to the GoFundMe for Dane Cook, throw some money at him, and I will also put a link to my original article that I wrote, you know, probably over a decade ago now, which has some more detailed information and so on. All right, that's it for tonight.